Today I want to talk about what I call the zigzag model of skill acquisition, or why you should be going to extreme when trying to learn a skill. And that skill could be, of course, a physical skill, sports, for example, but it could also be learning how to do your work better. So when you go to work, you don't want to just get work done, but you also want to get better at doing this work. That's basically the entire idea behind this channel. Uh, Also, studying is, of course, a skill. It can be learned. Reading, everything basically is a skill to some extent. Um, so, the basic idea that is going around, it's the most commonly accepted, is that you want to be basically balanced between two extremes. So not going too far into that direction or too far into the other. You want to be balanced, so everything always in the middle. And that's not something that I really agree with, because that's kind of retroactive, because you first have to know what the limit is, from one side and from the other, to be able to get that line in the middle. But that doesn't really matter anyway, because more importantly, when you are learning something, you need to try things out, basically go into one extreme and then to the other. So there's this famous example of practice, again, sports practice, the easiest example, uh, where people were learning how to shoot hoops from a certain distance, right? That was their end goal: learn to shoot from this distance. Uh, and they tried, either people were uh, shooting always from the same distance, the end distance, uh, or they were going a little bit forward, maybe a little bit back, maybe a little bit to the left, to the right. Uh, and so the group that better learned the skill in the same amount of time were the second group. So the group that changed things up a little bit. And this should be obvious, because when you change things up, you see how the different variables interact and change, right? So, for example, if you go a little bit forward, you get an idea of errors or margins of errors that you can have. You go a little bit forward, you have to shoot a little less forcefully, with a little bit less force. You get a little bit back, you have to shoot a little bit more forcefully. To the left, you have to account for the angle, to the right also. So also to the forth and back, you also have to account for the angle up and down. So you get an idea of how those variables change and how that change transfers over to, well, what's going to happen, where the ball is going to travel. So you get a better idea of, you get to feel out, for example, how much force you need to apply, right? So this is, in my opinion, pretty pretty intuitive. Again, you get an intuition also, but it's intuitive conceptually, that you should do that instead of just shooting always from the same place. And in my opinion, extremes are also very important in this, for the reason I actually said before, that you don't know where the balance point is. So if you have one point, the end goal distance from which you're going to shoot, of course, around this point is where you should practice. But if you're talking about, for example, how long you should study for, well, I guess 45 minutes, 25 minutes, and then take a 5-minute break, basically the Pomodoro technique. But what's going to happen when you take 2 hours of work, right? You don't know basically what's going to happen. And with things that are not so obvious, not so easy to feel out, if you take 5 minutes or 1 hour, only then you're going to see a huge difference, really, in terms of your focus intensity, for example. Right, so this is the zigzag. The y-axis is, for example, the length of how long you're going to study for. It's whatever spectrum you're using, whatever you're trying to fill out. And the extremes are, of course, 2 hours of learning non-stop, 5 minutes of learning, and then that's it. Right, so you're going from one extreme to the other, and then it's a zigzag because on the x direction, this is skill acquisition. So you go to the right, and that means that you're better at this skill. So you go from 5 minutes to 2 hours, and then maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour and a half, and you sort of go to the right, and maybe you end up in the middle between those two, so an hour, but you don't really know where you're going to end up. And it doesn't necessarily have to converge into one point. It can always you can just keep going from one extreme to the other, and that's kind of periodization, really. So you get used to, for example, very short periods of work, 15 minutes, maybe something like for a year you have been studying in the 10 to 25 minute range. And then you kind of forget what it's like to study for longer and what value that has. So what I talked about 2 years ago was that when you study for a long time, you have everything fresh in your mind. So everything that you've read, for example, or that you've remembered, you have access in your short-term memory. You don't have to go back. So that's the positive. And then you can also immerse yourself, so to say, in the work much more when you do it 2 hours non-stop. So you forget what the benefits of that are, and then you can go back to studying for an hour to 2 hours at a time, so long periods of time, and maybe you do that for half a year, and then you realize that it's too taxing or something, and then you go back to the first method of short blocks, and you go back and forth, but it's always fresh. It's always, the other option is always better. So it's like you're discovering this new thing, this new method. Actually, I should be studying for 2 hours. This is so much better. And then you go back. Actually, 10 minutes is so much better. And then you can cycle that, right? So you either converge or you don't. Whatever works for you, for your particular situation, what skill you're trying to work to master. And so my examples of that, that was one example. So short periods of work versus a long period of work. Where I noticed this first was actually in the bench press. Maybe if your bench press is pretty good, then and you find it easy and simple, then you can think of the overhead press, which is much more technically difficult. Uh, and that was with regards to speed. So technically, more speed is always better. But actually, you get out of the groove, uh, and it just you lose control, you lose muscle tension, uh, and it doesn't work out well. So with my bench press, I actually first started when I started out, I was trying to be as explosive as possible, but then I changed into going very slow and with perfect control throughout the entire range of motion. Uh, each each microscopic moment was perfectly controlled, and then with that, you have to keep that, but do it as fast as possible, so to say. Uh, so really, it's not about speed anyway. If you just took, I don't know, Eddie Hall's speed, if you just registered that speed and you lifted with the same speed, you would get none of the results. Maybe if you were going way too fast and then you notice that he goes actually slower, then you would get the benefits of learning what it's like to overhead press slower. Again, I'm mixing up bench press and overhead press. Anyway, um, so yes, the end goal value of the balance point, let's say, of the skill doesn't matter in my opinion that much. As much as what matters is you understanding the skill, understanding what you're doing, and getting an intuition. So that's why this is a zigzag, and it kind of shows that you're going up and down, but really that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you are, up or down. You're still moving to the right, and that's almost independent of going up and down. You just have to keep moving up and down to get to the right. If you just keep doing the same thing, then you're not going to move far to the right. Another example is maybe after the example of long versus short periods of work, uh, the most obvious to me, the most I don't know how to say it, the most clear or the most likely to work for you if you just take this advice and try to apply it to something, and that would be energized work or caffeinated work, really. You can of course pump yourself up without caffeine, but if you do take caffeine, then that's going to pump you up more. Versus calm work, and calm also, the benefit of calm is mainly that you get to keep perspective. So Jocko Willink says that you are your commander and your troops, but you are not your commander at the same time when you are your troops. So he also says that when he needs to keep perspective, he physically removes himself from the situation. So, for example, he lowers his weapon, and then he can think more clearly, think from a big picture perspective. So that's the benefit of going calm. So those are two extremes of the spectrum, and you can, so either caffeinate yourself or pump yourself up, rev yourself up, they also like to say in the lifting community, or go in calm, everything clear, big picture perspective. Another one is working smart versus working hard, also something that I've talked about extensively, maybe even. Working hard meaning just grinding through. So this is kind of like what I said before with the caffeinated and keeping perspective, but it's not the same. For example, the Excel example from last video, of course, you can either try to do everything as smart as possible, 300 IQ moves all the time, or just grinding through, not thinking too much, just really sharp focus. And that also brings me on to another point about this zigzag method, and that's actually kind of mentioned it at the beginning, that you don't know where the balance point is, but you also learn when to utilize this method, the method of going smart versus just grinding through. So for example, a task, you don't know whether you should go smart or go dumb and just work really hard on it. If you don't do it with one of those methods, or you don't do a similar task, either smart or hard. So if you just try to shoot for the reasonable approach, like I should do it reasonably smart, but if it's like just 5 cells in Excel, then maybe let's fill it out manually. Then you're not going to experience and get an intuition again for when you should do things more smart or when you should do things more dumb. So that's important to have that experience of just, again, doing something as smart as possible for everything, no matter what, because then you're going to experience what it is when you try to do everything smart for a task that you think it's unreasonable to do so. Maybe it isn't actually. Maybe you should be more smart about some things that you just think should be done with hard work. Another example, something that I talked about again 2 years ago, cultivating your motivation versus just grinding through. Or actually this applies to all my methods, which are basically extremes. I mean, they are extreme methods. Like I mentioned ones that you should at least once in your life or something like that have like 2 or 3 days where you just do one thing and eat as little as possible, like maybe have cartons of milk that you drink instead of eating, maybe with some supplements, right? It's good to be healthy, reasonably, and just sleep, but again, everything needs to be dialed down. Don't even shower. You can survive 3 days without showering. You need to have that experience. Maybe you don't, but it's useful. This is an extreme approach, but again, it's this extreme where you learn something, because if you are always just reasonable, then you don't know what it's like at the extremes. So that's why again, extremes are important, very important. uh, and again, for things that are not clear, we're not talking about uh, things that you can fill out, like, what's the difference between, again, 15 minutes versus 25 minutes of work. You're not going to feel that one is better or the other. You're going to feel that difference when it's 15 minutes versus an hour. So that's, again, another point. And the last point, or the last example, is logging everything in your calendar, having blocks for everything. If you do end up procrastinating, then you also need to log that. Just having the whole calendar filled out with blocks of work. You also should experience that. It's useful. As you can see in my calendar now, it's pretty empty. This is the other extreme. So not logging anything, just going by intuition what you need to do next, what you know that you need to do next, right? So this is kind of like big perspective thinking and acting towards your goals versus just focused right in front of you. What are the next tasks? And I would say focusing what is only right in front of you, you should do that only for short periods of time. It's not going to teach you a lot. It's just a method of resensitizing yourself to what it's like to have everything planned out and go by the plan. A reasonable approach would be probably to think for some time, some periods of the day, where you just focus on the next task on the list or in your mind, and then maybe in the weekends you plan out your life and think about the weekend, something like this. That's a reasonable approach, but people are different also, so you need to figure out what works best for you. And this is not like a snowflake thing. You just, what you're going to learn, you need to learn on yourself. You're not going to, again, you can't just copy someone else's balance point and just you don't learn anything that way, right? This is what I talked about, the speed on the bench press or the overhead press. It's not about everyone is special, everyone is unique, everyone is a snowflake. It's about you need to learn it by yourself, basically. And that's going to, your individual variance is going to be taken into account, but that's not really the point. The individual variance can be small, but you still need to learn it on yourself. And I think that's about it. And see you in 3 years this time.